Hillside Lane was the kind of quiet suburban street you'd expect to see on a postcard. Lined with oak trees and modest single-story homes, it exuded a gentle warmth that newcomers found irresistible. Children often rode bikes along the pavement. Neighbors greeted each other with friendly nods, and the evening air carried the aroma of cut grass or home-cooked meals. I moved into a pale yellow bungalow near the middle of the lane, hoping for a peaceful life. At first glance, that's exactly what I got. A tranquil community, an efficient homeowners association, HOA, that managed basic maintenance, and neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. But beneath the calm surface lay the presence of a formidable woman, a mid-aged HOA board member who went by the name Karen, though her legal name was Beatrice Arkley. Taller than average, with precisely styled hair and an ever-present expression of disapproval, she had a habit of talking down to people as if only she knew what was best. During my first month, I heard tales of Karen's interventions on everything from mailbox designs to acceptable lawn ornament sizes. She had a reputation for pushing the HOA's rules to extremes, sometimes ignoring the board's other members. Still, I figured these stories might be exaggerations, until one morning, I witnessed the first sign of trouble. Karen scolding an older neighbor for overwatering a flower bed in front of his porch. That neighbor was Mr. Reed, a gentle, silver-haired man in his late 70s who had lived on Hillside Lane for decades. He adored gardening, tending to beds of chrysanthemums, roses, and marigolds, making his yard a bright splash of color. On that morning, as I jogged past, Karen stood at Mr. Reed's fence line, arms crossed, lecturing him about unnecessary water usage. He listened politely, but looked worried. At the time, I shrugged it off. Maybe Karen was just championing environmental awareness. But I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Something about her tone felt confrontational, self-righteous. Little did I know how far she'd go to enforce her personal vision of water conservation. Life on Hillside Lane flowed smoothly enough for the next couple of weeks. I got into a routine, morning jogs, work, then leisurely evenings reading on my porch. The only real excitement came from small neighborly interactions or the occasional HOA newsletter. Some nights, I'd see Mr. Reed outside, watering his beloved flowers in the early evening light, humming softly as water dripped from his hose onto his well-tended beds. Sometimes I'd stroll by, wave hello, and chat. Mr. Reed would beam, explaining which seeds he'd planted, how he rotated fertilizer, or how he timed watering to avoid the midday sun. Best to water in the morning or evening, he'd say, so it soaks in before the heat evaporates it. That way, you don't waste a drop. He was always gentle and considerate, never splashing water onto the sidewalk or letting it run idle. Yet I noticed Karen's presence during these times, too. She'd wander down the street, clipboard in hand, glancing sharply at any sign of a running hose or sprinkler. On a couple of occasions, she paused at Mr. Reed's fence, scribbling notes. He told me she had begun leaving written warnings about limiting irrigation to save resources. Hillside Lane was not in a drought zone, nor were there official water restrictions in place from the county, but Karen seemed determined to impose her own rules. You know, Mr. Reed confided to me once, I'm all for conserving water, but my flowers need a drink. I'm not flooding the street. I use a moderate trickle. He lifted the hose, showing the gentle stream. And I pay for my water bill. I'm not sure what her problem is. I tried to reassure him, suggesting the rest of the HOA board might see sense if Karen escalated. After all, it was just a modest yard. But as the days passed, Karen's demands grew more pointed. She emailed the neighborhood, urging we rethink excessive greenery and plant drought-tolerant shrubs. She singled out Mr. Reed's garden as overabundant. I started sensing a brewing conflict. Mr. Reed was proud of his flowers. He'd cultivated them for decades. Karen, fixated on visual uniformity and responsible usage, wanted them gone or reduced. Something had to give. But none of us guessed Karen would turn to sabotage, let alone do something as drastic as burying a garden hose in mud. Summer arrived, bringing slightly warmer weather and occasional afternoon showers. Mr. Reed's flowers thrived in the mild climate, bursting with vibrant petals. The neighborhood generally admired his garden. Some neighbors even asked him for tips. Each morning, he'd wake early to water the roots, ensuring the moisture soaked into the soil before the sun rose too high. Yet Karen grew more vocal. She cornered Ms. Blake, a single mother next door, telling her she should reduce lawn size to minimize irrigation. She left notes on a few other lawns, suggesting they embrace a desert-friendly aesthetic. But no yard triggered her ire like Mr. Reed's. She argued it was too extravagant and a waste of our natural resources. Neighbors rolled their eyes at these pronouncements, but she didn't let up. At the monthly HOA meeting, Karen tried to push a motion restricting watering to certain days, citing new guidelines. However, the rest of the board refused, pointing out that no city mandate existed and that the HOA didn't have the authority to impose stricter rules. Undeterred, Karen insisted that voluntary compliance with her plan was wise. She glared at Mr. Reed, who quietly sat in the audience. Her frustration became obvious. She believed the board should yield to her environmental concerns, even if they lacked official backing. Tension simmered. Mr. Reed, for his part, said he was happy to reduce water usage if an actual drought arose. But until then, he saw no reason to let his flowers wither. One evening, as the sun set, I noticed Karen pacing near Mr. Reed's fence, frowning at the coiled hose lying neatly by his spigot. She seemed transfixed, as though it personally offended her. That night, I had trouble sleeping, haunted by her intense expression. Something told me she might attempt an extreme measure if the board wouldn't authorize changes. But sabotage? It still sounded unthinkable, until it happened. It was on a bright Thursday morning in late June that the unexpected occurred. I stepped outside around 7 a.m. for a short walk, enjoying the cool breeze before the day's heat set in. As I passed Mr. Reed's house, I noticed him crouched on his lawn, rummaging around. His hose was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he was pulling at lumps of sodden earth. His face looked bewildered. "Mr. Reed," I called softly, approaching the fence. "Is everything okay?" He glanced up, concern etched in his features. "Morning. I can't find my hose. It was always coiled here." He pointed to a spot by the spigot. "Now there's just this pile of mud, as if someone dug a trench." He gestured to a shallow groove in the soil that ran along the fence line. The ground looked recently disturbed, with patches of damp earth scattered. The faint imprint of a hose shape was visible, half buried in the mud. Bits of green rubber poked out in places. It was as if someone had forcibly crammed the hose into the ground, covering it with dirt. Stunned, I helped him tug at the partial loops. Sure enough, the hose was jammed beneath the soil. Who would do this?" I muttered, yanking on it. The hose refused to budge easily. It was twisted around a small root, possibly intentionally. We spent several minutes freeing a length of it, but more was stuck deeper. Mr. Reed's hands shook. He paused, rubbing his forehead. "This can't be an accident. Someone must have done this last night. I can't imagine why." Though not naming her, we both suspected Karen. No one else had openly complained about his watering. But burying a hose? That was bizarre and vicious. We managed to extract about half the length, but the rest was thoroughly tangled. Mr. Reed decided to let it be for the moment, lest he damage his flower roots further by digging blindly. We parted ways with an unspoken understanding. We needed answers. Why had someone sabotaged a harmless garden hose? And how should we respond? My mind reeled with the possibility that Karen might have taken her crusade to a whole new level. But I needed proof before leveling accusations. Later that morning, Mr. Reed and I convened with a few friendly neighbors: Ms. Blake, Mr. Nguyen from across the street, and Mrs. Faulkner, an early retiree who often walked her dog past Mr. Reed's garden. We gathered by the fence, inspecting the bizarre scene. Muddy lumps, a partially unearthed hose, footprints in the soft soil. The footprints were faint, but Mrs. Faulkner swore she recognized Karen's distinctive shoe prints from prior run-ins. Mr. Nguyen bent down, studying the marks. "Seems like someone used a small shovel or trowel to dig a shallow trench, then pressed the hose in, covering it with mud. They left in a hurry. Look at these scuff marks." He pointed to scattered dirt near the edge of the fence. Indeed, the intrusion looked rushed. "We should check if any security cameras caught movement," Ms. Blake suggested. "Do you have one, Mr. Reed?" He shook his head sadly. "No, I never saw the need. It's a safe neighborhood. Or so I thought." We also wondered if any neighbor might have glimpsed activity. Mrs. Faulkner said she'd heard faint scraping sounds around midnight, but assumed it was a stray cat or something. "I didn't think a person would be messing with a hose," she admitted, sighing. Ms. Blake frowned, her voice tense. Karen's the only one who's openly complained about water use. This is extreme, though. If she's behind it, that's vandalism. The group seemed united in suspecting Karen, but we lacked definitive proof. Even so, we agreed to approach the HOA board about the incident, describing the sabotage and requesting an investigation. Meanwhile, Mr. Reed felt uneasy. Should I redig the hose out fully? Or should we wait to show the board the scene as is? We decided he'd refrain from removing it all to preserve the evidence of tampering. Ms. Blake snapped a few photos on her phone, capturing the half-buried hose and footprints. We parted with a plan to gather statements from neighbors, then confront the HOA at the next scheduled meeting or sooner if possible. Word spread fast along Hillside Lane that someone had buried Mr. Reed's garden hose. Neighbors gossiped in whispers, eyes darting. Some sympathized deeply with Mr. Reed, outraged that an innocent pastime of watering flowers had led to sabotage. Others, who typically stayed neutral about Karen's strict approach, were now forced to consider that she might have gone too far. That afternoon, Ms. Blake and I marched to the HOA office, a small, shared space in the local community center, to request an emergency discussion. The president, a mild-mannered man named Mr. Oliver, listened intently as Ms. Blake showed him photos. He looked appalled. Sabotaging property? That's not just an HOA matter. It's practically a crime. We suggested that Karen was the prime suspect, citing her vehement complaints. Mr. Oliver sighed. She has been vocal about water usage. But I need more than suspicion. Have you spoken to her? We admitted we hadn't. So Mr. Oliver agreed to gather the board, Karen included, for an urgent meeting the next day, letting us present evidence. We left, feeling a mix of relief and nerves. That evening, as I walked home, I spotted Karen near the corner, apparently returning from a jog. My heart pounded. Should I ask her point-blank about the hose sabotage? Mustering courage, I approached. Karen, I called. Have you heard about Mr. Reed's garden hose being buried? Her eyes flicked with momentary surprise. Then her face hardened. I've heard rumors. Ridiculous. Why would anyone bury a hose? I narrowed my gaze. He's missing half of it, stuck in the ground near your fence line. People suspect sabotage, especially given your concerns about watering. Karen stiffened, crossing her arms. I have no idea who did that. And let me remind you, water usage is a serious issue. That old man drenches his yard day and night. If someone's trying to send a message, well, perhaps he should consider cutting back. Her words sounded callous, near an admission of approval. But she didn't explicitly confess. My frustration flared. That's a harsh attitude. He's not drenching anything. He's moderate. This is sabotage, Karen. She shrugged. I disapprove of waste, but I'm no vandal. Then she spun on her heel and strode off, leaving me fuming. It felt like she was deflecting suspicion, possibly lying outright. I hurried home, more convinced than ever of her guilt. The following day's HOA meeting would be critical. The next afternoon, the HOA board convened in a modest meeting room at the community center. A handful of neighbors joined as onlookers, including Mr. Reed, Ms. Blake, Mr. Nguyen, and myself. The board members were Mr. Oliver, president, Ms. Grant, treasurer, and two others. Karen, an influential but not top-ranked board member, sat at the table as well, her expression unreadable. Mr. Oliver opened the session, explaining that an urgent complaint had arisen about vandalism involving Mr. Reed's property. He invited Ms. Blake and me to present evidence. We recounted the morning discovery, the half-buried hose, footprints, and Karen's prior hostility. Ms. Blake showed photos on her phone. The board leaned in, eyes wide with concern. Mr. Reed spoke softly, describing how he'd cared for his garden for decades with no trouble until recently. I'm in my late 70s, he said. I rely on that hose. This sabotage could have destroyed my flowers. It's so upsetting. Mr. Oliver looked pained. He turned to Karen. We know you voiced strong opinions on water usage. Did you have any role in this? Karen maintained a calm facade. Absolutely not. I find the entire notion preposterous. Why would I crawl around burying a hose? I simply advocate for responsible landscaping. If someone else took my words too far, that's not my responsibility. A tense silence hung. One board member, Ms. Grant, frowned. But you've been quite outspoken about Mr. Reed's garden specifically. Couldn't you have handled this legally, through the board, rather than sabotage? It's suspicious. Karen shot Ms. Grant a glare. Suspicion isn't proof. I am an HOA representative. I'd never stoop to vandalism. Mr. Nguyen spoke up from the audience. Your footprints were near the fence. People saw you wandering late at night. Or at least someone matching your build. That's quite a coincidence. Karen scoffed. You can't convict someone on a silhouette. And footprints in a yard with no security cameras? Speculation, nothing more. Ms. Blake tried pressing for more details. Karen, were you out late that evening? Did anyone see you at that time? Karen offered no direct answer, repeating that she had no recollection of that night's schedule. Another board member, Mr. Robinson, sighed. We can't forcibly blame her without evidence. However, the sabotage remains a serious matter. We must address Mr. Reed's concerns and ensure no further incidents. Ultimately, the board concluded they couldn't formally accuse Karen, lacking definitive proof. But they promised a thorough inquiry, encouraging neighbors to share any additional observations or footage. Mr. Oliver apologized to Mr. Reed, pledging to help him recover damages. Karen sat stiffly, face tight. We left feeling both disappointed and determined. If official justice was slow, perhaps the neighborhood would take a stand in its own way. In the wake of that inconclusive meeting, frustration rippled through Hillside Lane. Mr. Reed still had a hose half embedded in his yard. The board couldn't or wouldn't penalize Karen without concrete proof. Meanwhile, Karen carried on with her daily routine, ignoring the hush of resentment around her. But a fresh idea emerged one weekend when Ms. Blake, Mr. Nguyen, and I gathered on Mr. Reed's porch for a chat. We brainstormed ways to protect his garden from further sabotage and maybe address Karen's water concerns in a clever way. Mr. Nguyen suggested a hidden drip irrigation system. It's actually more water efficient than a standard hose. We can lay tubing beneath the soil, delivering moisture directly to the roots. That way, we avoid surface runoff or evaporation. And guess what? If it's underground, Karen can't see it to sabotage it. We all perked up. A drip system would drastically reduce water usage while keeping the flowers healthy. It might also undercut Karen's entire argument that Mr. Reed was wasting water. Ms. Blake grinned. That's brilliant. If we make it even more efficient than the hose, she can't possibly complain, right? Mr. Reed looked intrigued but hesitant. I've heard about drip irrigation, but I'm not very tech-savvy. Is it difficult to install? Mr. Nguyen waved off the concern. Not too bad. We can buy a kit from a hardware store, bury lines around the flower beds, and hook them to a timer. You can still control how much water flows, but it'll be hidden. Less open watering to provoke Karen. We grew excited, discussing the details, placement, cost, how to ensure coverage for all plants. The idea was appealing. We'd turn a sabotage incident into a chance to upgrade. Ms. Blake suggested we approach the HOA with the plan. They might help fund it, or at least commend the water-saving approach. Once it's official, Karen can't sabotage it without defying a recognized community improvement. Mr. Reed's eyes twinkled. I love the irony. Her burying my hose leads me to bury a better system. Let's do it. We agreed to present a formal proposal at the next HOA meeting, emphasizing efficiency and minimal surface watering. If accepted, we'd install the system with the help of volunteers, ensuring Mr. Reed's garden thrived while using less water. And best of all, it would be beyond Karen's ability to sabotage with a shovel. Over the following week, Ms. Blake and I worked with Mr. Reed and Mr. Nguyen to draft a neat proposal for the HOA. We included approximate costs for tubing, a timer, connectors, and possible installation labor. We highlighted how drip irrigation could reduce water usage by up to 50% compared to standard hoses, aligning with any environmental concerns. We also pointed out it would be subtle, not messing with the neighborhood's visual style. No more sight of a big green hose lying on the grass. When the next HOA meeting rolled around, we walked in with a sense of purpose. Residents sat in folding chairs around the community center hall, waiting for updates on the sabotage investigation. Karen, perched at the board's table, looked tense. She avoided eye contact with us. Mr. Oliver started by acknowledging the sabotage situation remained unresolved, as no new evidence had emerged. He expressed regret that Mr. Reed was still left with a half-buried hose. Then Ms. Blake asked for the floor. We stepped up, handing out copies of our proposal. In a calm, clear voice, Ms. Blake explained how drip irrigation would solve multiple issues. Efficient water use. The system targets roots directly, minimizing waste. Hidden setup. No visible hose for anyone to tamper with or object to aesthetically. Healthier plants. Drip lines reduce fungal issues that can arise from overhead watering. Mr. Reed added, "This would keep my flowers alive while drastically reducing the volume of water. I'm happy to pay for it myself, but if the HOA wants to adopt similar systems or partially subsidize, that'd be a community benefit." The board members flipped through the proposal. Mr. Robinson asked technical questions about cost and longevity. Mr. Nguyen answered confidently, citing a few references from local gardening experts. Ms. Grant seemed impressed by the potential water savings, remarking that it could quell any future arguments about wasteful watering. Karen, however, sat rigid. Once the others finished discussing, she cleared her throat. "A drip system, it sounds complex. Are we sure it won't lead to hidden leaks underground? That could cause damage or mold. And how do we confirm it's used responsibly, not left running all day?" I spoke up. "The timer ensures water only runs for specific intervals. We can adjust based on soil moisture. It's actually more controlled than a regular hose." Karen's lips pressed thin. I still worry about the aesthetics. Underground lines might disturb the lawn." Mr. Nguyen shook his head. "They're thin tubes, discreet. We bury them just below the surface. If anything, it's neater than hoses lying around." The board members nodded, apparently swayed. Mr. Oliver concluded, "This seems like a positive solution that addresses both water efficiency and the need for Mr. Reed's garden. I propose we endorse it as a pilot project. Mr. Reed can install it, and if it proves successful, maybe others can follow suit." The board voted. 3 out of 4 members raised hands in support. Only Karen abstained, muttering something under her breath. The motion passed. The neighbors applauded. Mr. Reed grinned with relief. Our plan was now officially sanctioned. After the meeting, Karen slipped away quickly, avoiding any direct confrontation. Over the next few days, she largely kept her distance from Mr. Reed's property. One might assume she felt cornered. Her sabotage had backfired, spurring a more sophisticated irrigation system that the HOA now openly endorsed. For a brief spell, we enjoyed a sense of victory. Mr. Reed purchased the drip kit and started preparing the flower beds. With Mr. Nguyen's help, he mapped out the lines to ensure coverage for each section. Volunteers from the street offered to help dig shallow trenches and lay tubing. On a sunny Saturday, we gathered at Mr. Reed's front yard, shovels in hand, working cheerfully. It felt like a block party, with neighbors bonding over a project that would normally be done solo. Karen didn't appear. A couple of times, we spotted her curtain twitching from inside her house across the street. But she never ventured out, never confronted us. Perhaps she realized her direct approach had failed. By late afternoon, we finished installing the main lines, hooking them up to a small electronic timer near the spigot. Mr. Reed tested it, letting a gentle trickle flow through the drip emitters. The water seeped directly to the roots, with minimal surface runoff. Everyone admired how unobtrusive it was. The previously upturned soil from the sabotage was now neatly replanted. As we packed up tools, Ms. Blake joked, "I wonder if Karen regrets burying that hose now." We ended up with an even better setup. Mr. Reed chuckled softly. If that was her plan all along, she sure had an odd way of showing it. We all knew she'd never intended to help. But ironically, that sabotage had galvanized the neighbors into a cooperative solution. In the hush of dusk, as the drip system quietly released water into the soil, I marveled at how adversity sometimes leads to unexpected progress. Within a week, Mr. Reed's garden began to flourish like never before. The drip irrigation ensured precise moisture levels, each plant receiving just enough to thrive. The early morning timer ran for half an hour, then shut off automatically. Neighbors remarked how the flowers looked even more vibrant. Mr. Reed, beaming with pride, said he hardly needed to drag out a hose now. He just occasionally spot-watered if a particular corner needed extra. Word spread about the system's success. Ms. Grant from the board visited to see it firsthand. She marveled at the neatness. "This is so discreet," she said. "No water pooling on sidewalks. Even the mulch stays relatively dry on top." She asked for permission to photograph the setup, planning to share it in the next HOA newsletter as an example of smart water usage. Mr. Reed agreed, happy to help others adopt a similar method. It felt like a turning point. The sabotage no longer overshadowed the garden's daily routine. Instead, the community was celebrating an innovative approach. Still, there was one holdout. Karen. She made no comment publicly about the drip system. Some neighbors guessed she might be stewing in private, upset that her intimidation had backfired. Others worried she might hatch another plan. But with official HOA approval behind the drip lines, sabotaging them would risk serious repercussions. Not that she'd been deterred by risk before, but the climate of neighborly unity had grown. If she made another move, she'd face an even bigger backlash. For now, we enjoyed the lull. Mr. Reed's yard became a local talking point for all the right reasons: beauty, efficiency, community spirit. Each time I passed, I recalled how it might never have happened if not for Karen's midnight trench digging. A classic example of how adversity can foster positive change. As midsummer settled in, Hillside Lane basked in bright sunshine. Small talk among neighbors revolved around upcoming holiday plans, kids finishing the school year, and Mr. Reed's triumphant flower beds. People seemed in good spirits, with no fresh drama from Karen. I found myself, somewhat naively, hoping she'd accepted defeat. Perhaps she recognized that the drip system was better for water conservation than her vandalizing approach, so maybe she'd let the matter rest. After all, who could logically argue against a system that saved water and kept the neighborhood lovely? But a corner of my mind remembered her fanatic streak. Once fixated on something, she rarely let go. Then again, each day that passed without incident made me more complacent, lulled by the calm. Ms. Blake expressed a similar relief. "We might actually have peace," she said one afternoon, sipping iced tea on my porch. "Karen must see she can't stop us from enjoying our gardens responsibly." Mr. Reed also relaxed. He told me he'd left the original half-buried hose in the garage, deciding he didn't need it anymore. "No point in relaying it. The drip lines do the job," he said. Maybe Karen did me a favor in a weird way. And so, for a time, the community breathed easy. The sabotage had led to a beneficial outcome, and Karen was lying low. We had no clue that she still harbored resentment, nor that she was quietly seeking a new angle to prove her point about unnecessary greenery. The threat might be dormant, but it wasn't gone. One muggy afternoon in July, two men in official-looking shirts strolled down Hillside Lane, taking notes and snapping photos of front yards. Alarmed neighbors watched from windows or porches. The men occasionally stopped to peer at gardens, writing on clipboards. People whispered that they might be from the city's water department or some environmental agency. Ms. Blake approached them, asking if they needed help. One introduced himself as an environmental enforcement officer, the other as a city water usage specialist. They said they'd received a tip about possible over-irrigation in the neighborhood. "We're here to investigate any code violations," one said. "Is there a known problem area?" Ms. Blake frowned, pointing out that our county wasn't under mandatory water restrictions. The men nodded politely, explaining that if there was a complaint, they had to check. They specifically asked about excessive flower gardens or constant sprinklers. People in earshot exchanged glances, instantly suspecting Karen had filed a complaint, trying to spark a city crackdown. Soon, they made their way to Mr. Reed's property. He greeted them politely, explaining the new drip system. The officers tested the spigot, asked about watering schedules, and observed that the topsoil wasn't even damp. They seemed impressed. "This is actually quite efficient," the water specialist remarked. "Far from excessive. The complaint might be unfounded if this is the only yard in question." They left, apparently finding no wrongdoing. Neighbors exhaled in relief, but the sense of intrusion lingered. That evening, Ms. Blake and I confronted Karen, who was spotted returning from a grocery trip. We asked if she'd reported the neighborhood for water violations. She gave a thin smile. "I have no comment. But if officials decide to investigate, that's their call." Her smug tone suggested she might have orchestrated it. We realized she wasn't giving up. Even though sabotage had failed, she was seeking official measures to hinder what she deemed wasteful gardens. Another wave of tension swept the lane. If Karen was pulling strings with city agencies, we needed to be vigilant. Amid the worry of potential city scrutiny, Mr. Reed received surprising news. The HOA decided to formally recognize his drip irrigation setup as a model project. They planned to mention it in the next monthly newsletter, praising it as a prime example of how to balance beautiful landscaping with resource conservation. In a short ceremony, Mr. Oliver and Ms. Gran arrived at Mr. Reed's front yard with a small plaque. It read, "In recognition of innovative water stewardship, Mr. Reed's drip irrigation garden, honoring a forward-thinking and neighborly approach. Several residents gathered, clapping as Mr. Oliver handed Mr. Reed the plaque. Mr. Reed blushed with shy pride, thanking everyone for their support. "I never aimed for recognition," he said with a chuckle. "I just love my flowers. But it's nice to share the methods with others who might benefit." Karen stood off to one side, arms folded. She hadn't known about the ceremony, apparently. Her face remained impassive, but her jaw tightened each time someone applauded. As Ms. Grant snapped photos for the HOA newsletter, Karen slipped away, making no attempt to congratulate Mr. Reed. Later, as the small crowd dispersed, Ms. Blake nudged me, whispering, "I bet this stings Karen. She tried to sabotage him, and now he's being honored." I nodded, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and worry. Would this public commendation inflame her resentment further? Still, the majority of neighbors seemed cheerful, celebrating that good sense had prevailed. The sabotage story, once an outrage, now shaped a narrative of triumph and positive change. In quiet corners, though, we wondered how Karen might respond to being so thoroughly upstaged. Over the next 2 weeks, life on Hillside Lane continued in a relatively peaceful rhythm. Mr. Reed's new plaque hung near his porch, a small token of pride. The city officials never returned, presumably satisfied that no code violations existed. But a subtle undercurrent of tension persisted. Karen began dropping hints in casual conversation about excessive landscaping leading to future problems. She cornered Ms. Faulkner one afternoon, ranting about how elaborate gardens could draw pests or cause water runoffs into storm drains. None of these claims had actual basis, yet Karen spoke with authority. Ms. Faulkner politely excused herself, unsettled by Karen's fixation. One evening, Ms. Blake confided that a neighbor had overheard Karen on her phone, talking about a petition to limit non-native plants in the neighborhood. Could she be planning to push an HOA rule restricting certain flowers? The possibility felt absurd, but after seeing how far Karen went burying a hose, nothing seemed impossible. She might try to pass off some half-baked regulation that forced Mr. Reed to remove certain blooms. A sense of foreboding hung over us. Though the sabotage fiasco ended with the drip system victory, Karen's spirit of meddling remained. Each time she walked by, scanning lawns, I felt a prickling fear that she sought a new angle to clamp down on the garden. And while the board had shown support for Mr. Reed, they also tended to move slowly on disputes, giving Karen space to maneuver. We decided to remain on alert. Mr. Reed, though content with his improved setup, confided in me that he sometimes felt uneasy, worried that Karen's next move might involve official forms or city complaints. "She's not the type to just let it go," he sighed. "I love my flowers, but I'm getting old. Part of me wonders if the stress is worth it." Hearing his resignation stung. He'd done nothing wrong, yet he felt pressured. Ms. Blake, Mr. Nguyen, and I reassured him we'd have his back if another storm brewed. August arrived, bringing a wave of heat. The next HOA meeting loomed, and neighbors braced for possible fireworks if Karen unveiled new regulations. The meeting was held in the community center's multipurpose room, large enough to seat a few dozen folks. Turnout was higher than usual, likely because everyone sensed tension in the air. As the meeting began, Mr. Oliver addressed routine items, budget updates, scheduling for road maintenance, a reminder about pet leash policies. All calm. Then Karen raised her hand. My stomach clenched. She cleared her throat dramatically. "I'd like to propose a new guideline," she announced. "Due to ongoing concerns about water overuse on certain properties, we should consider restricting the size of non-native flower beds. A maximum square footage, ensuring water is not wasted on decorative plants. Residents can still enjoy greenery, but not to an excessive degree." A hush fell. People exchanged incredulous looks. Ms. Grant frowned. "Karen, we have no pressing water shortage, and the city has not mandated anything. Are you sure this is necessary?" Karen nodded emphatically. "We must be proactive. Even drip irrigation can be misused if the bed is too large. This is about preserving resources. We can't allow a handful of whimsical gardeners to drain the aquifer." Anger flickered in the audience. Mr. Reed, though sitting quietly, clenched his jaw. Ms. Blake spoke up. "No data suggests we're draining anything. We've had normal rainfall. Our county imposes no restrictions. This feels like an overreach." Karen's eyes flared. "Overreach? It's called foresight. Many HOAs limit lawn sizes or require drought-tolerant landscaping. I'm merely ensuring we stay ahead of potential crises. Ms. Grant looked uncertain, but Mr. Oliver hesitated. Another board member, Ms. Tully, spoke. I see no evidence to support that we need such a drastic measure. The board can't arbitrarily limit flower beds. That would infringe on personal property rights. Karen bristled. As an HOA, we can set design standards. A heated debate ensued. Neighbors criticized the proposal, calling it unnecessary and unfair. Karen refused to back down, citing random statistics about water scarcity. Eventually, Ms. Tully called for a show of hands. Nearly everyone opposed the idea. Ms. Grant and Mr. Oliver politely but firmly told Karen that the board would not pursue her suggested rule. Karen sat, face reddening with frustration. The meeting moved on, but the atmosphere buzzed with tension. Once again, she'd failed to impose her vision. We all breathed relief that the board stood firm. But Ms. Blake whispered to me, she won't stop, you know. She'll keep trying until she finds a loophole. Summer waned, giving way to the milder days of early autumn. Mr. Reed's garden, though still bright, began shifting to fall blooms. The drip system continued to run smoothly. The sabotage affair faded into memory for many. Even Karen's unsuccessful attempt to limit flower beds became old news. For a few weeks, Hillside Lane felt almost idyllic. Children returned to school, and neighbors planned small gatherings, like a harvest-themed potluck. Mr. Reed happily chatted with passers-by about autumn planting tips. Meanwhile, Karen seemed subdued, seldom attending community events. Some assumed she'd finally grown tired of her crusade, or maybe turned her attention elsewhere. Yet a sense of caution lingered among those who'd experienced her fervor. Ms. Blake noticed Karen browsing at a local hardware store, inquiring about soil testing kits and pesticide regulations. The store clerk reported she seemed fixated on the idea that excessive plantings attract pests. Another neighbor mentioned Karen asked about county-level codes for stormwater management. It looked like she was searching for any angle to clamp down on unnecessary flower beds, even if that meant going beyond the HOA. One crisp afternoon, Ms. Tully from the board visited Mr. Reed, praising his drip system. She confided that Karen was pressuring the board to push for a comprehensive landscaping revision, claiming she had found a county ordinance that might force changes. Ms. Tully shrugged. We suspect she's twisting the language. We're ignoring her for now, but keep an eye out. Mr. Reed sighed. I'm tired of living on guard. I'm just a retired man who loves his flowers. Why can't she leave me be? Ms. Tully gently assured him the board had no plans to hamper his garden. Still, the sense of looming confrontation wouldn't fully vanish. A few days later, Ms. Blake and I decided to take matters into our own hands. If Karen claimed to have found some obscure code in county regulations, we could investigate it ourselves. No sense letting her spread misinformation. We visited the county office building, requesting copies of relevant ordinances on water usage, stormwater runoff, and landscaping guidelines. The clerk guided us to a small public records room, where we pored over binders and digital documents. We found general advice about water conservation, references to possible watering restrictions in drought emergencies, and mention of controlling erosion near waterways. But nowhere did we see a rule forbidding moderate flower gardens or prescribing a maximum bed size. We took photos of key pages, highlighting sections that directly contradicted Karen's claims. One passage stated that private homeowners retain the right to cultivate landscaping of their choice unless a declared drought necessitates restrictions. Another noted that drip irrigation systems are encouraged for water efficiency, citing them as an ideal method in suburban settings. Armed with this information, Ms. Blake and I visited Mr. Oliver at the HOA office. We presented the official pages, explaining how they refuted any notion that county rules forced us to limit Mr. Reed's garden. Mr. Oliver nodded thoughtfully, promising to share them with the board if Karen pressed her arguments further. We felt relieved, confident that we'd outmaneuver any new attempt by Karen to cite invented regulations. As we left, Ms. Blake grinned. If she tries to wave a code around, we can show actual county documents. This time, she can't claim ignorance. Not long after our county office visit, Ms. Blake learned Karen had told Ms. Faulkner about a pending county crackdown, citing alleged ordinances. Furious, Ms. Blake marched to Karen's front porch with copies of the real documents. I joined her for moral support. Karen answered the door, regarding us coolly. Yes, she said, arms crossing. Ms. Blake held out the pages. We visited the county. There is no pending crackdown. These are the actual regulations. None of them support your stance. Why are you telling neighbors otherwise? Karen's eyes flicked to the documents. She barely glanced at them. I never said it was final. I merely warned Ms. Faulkner that the county might act in the future if water issues persist. And a thorough reading of the code can be interpreted in various ways. It's not black and white. I interjected. Stop trying to scare people with half-truths. The code explicitly states there's no limit on normal gardening. You're spreading false claims. Karen's jaw clenched. I am concerned about our environment. If some interpret that as alarmist, so be it. Perhaps you're all too complacent. Ms. Blake shot back. Look, if you truly want conservation, great. But sabotaging hoses and lying about codes is not the way. The HOA and county both support drip systems. Mr. Reed's is working fine. Let it go. Karen's face reddened with anger. She pointed a finger at Ms. Blake. Don't lecture me. I do what's best for this community, even if you're too short-sighted to see it. Mark my words, when the region eventually faces a water crisis, you'll regret your extravagance. With that, she slammed the door, leaving us standing on the porch, hearts racing. Ms. Blake and I exchanged glances, frustration and disbelief swirling. We had cornered her with facts, yet she doubled down, painting herself as a misunderstood savior. It seemed no logic could dissuade her. One afternoon, Mr. Reed confessed to me that the ongoing tension weighed heavily on him. Though his garden thrived, the emotional toll of constant vigilance was exhausting. He'd start each morning worried Karen might pop up with a new complaint or sabotage. Even though the drip system worked smoothly, he felt uneasy each time he stepped outside. He sighed, gazing at his blooming beds. I've lived here over 30 years, never had such stress. I used to find joy in watering, pruning, just quietly enjoying my flowers. Now I keep looking over my shoulder. I sympathized. This conflict overshadowed the simple pleasure he derived from gardening. Ms. Blake suggested we throw a small garden party or open house event in Mr. Reed's yard to celebrate the success of the drip system. Invite neighbors to see how nice it is, maybe gather positive support, she said. Shall we stand with him? Mr. Reed liked the idea, but worried it might provoke Karen. Ultimately, with gentle persuasion, he agreed. Perhaps a friendly get-together would boost morale, he said. And if Karen tries something, at least everyone will be there to see. We planned a casual late-afternoon gathering for the following Saturday. Neighbors would bring snacks, walk around the flower beds, share gardening tips. We hoped it would reaffirm that the community valued this green oasis, and that Karen's negativity wouldn't overshadow the lane's warmth. That Saturday, the sun shone bright, but not too hot, perfect for an outdoor event. Mr. Reed's front yard had a few folding chairs set up, plus a small table of refreshments Ms. Blake helped arrange. Neighbors trickled in, delighted to stroll among the flowers and admire the discreet drip lines. Some brought homemade treats or lemonade jugs, turning it into an impromptu block party. We chatted, relaxed, and praised Mr. Reed's dedication. He beamed, clearly uplifted by the support. Even Ms. Tully from the HOA board dropped by, expressing her admiration. As people mingled, it felt like the old spirit of Hillside Lane, friendly, inclusive, communal. Midway through, Ms. Faulkner tapped my shoulder, nodding toward the street. Karen stood on the sidewalk, observing from a distance. She wore a neutral expression, arms folded. For a moment, she seemed almost curious. I waved hesitantly, unsure how she'd respond. She didn't wave back, but neither did she storm away. After a pause, Karen stepped forward, entering the yard. Conversations quieted slightly, tension rippling. She hovered near the refreshment table, surveying the scene. People watched warily, expecting a scathing remark. Instead, she spoke in a measured tone. Quite a turnout for a garden party. Mr. Reed approached, cautious but polite. Yes, we're just celebrating the success of the drip system. Everyone's welcome to join. He gestured to the refreshments. Karen's gaze flicked over the cups of lemonade, the plates of cookies, the bright blossoms around her. Then, surprising everyone, she nodded. Congratulations on the system. It certainly looks discreet. A brief hush. Had Karen just given a grudging compliment? Ms. Blake and I exchanged astonished glances. Mr. Reed, equally startled, thanked her softly. She didn't smile, but she also didn't criticize. Instead, she commented, "At least it's less of an eyesore than a coiled hose." Though her words weren't exactly warm, it was the closest we'd heard to an admission that the new setup might be acceptable. Some neighbors exhaled, relieved there was no confrontation. She lingered a moment longer, then turned and left. A subtle swirl of confusion remained. Maybe she recognized she'd lost the battle. Maybe she was testing the waters for some next move. Regardless, the gathering resumed, Mr. Reed looking more cheerful. "If that's the best she can do for negativity, I'll take it," he joked quietly, earning soft laughter. In the days following the garden party, we heard no new demands from Karen. Some neighbors dared hope the conflict was finally behind us. Then Ms. Faulkner came to me with startling information. She claimed that on a walk late one night, she overheard Karen talking on her phone just inside an open window. Karen's tone was subdued, almost regretful. Ms. Faulkner recalled snatches of the conversation. Karen saying, "Well, I buried the hose to show them how water can vanish, but it all backfired." And something about the HOA praising that old man. Ms. Faulkner couldn't hear the entire exchange, but it sounded like Karen was venting to a friend or relative, admitting she'd orchestrated the sabotage. When Ms. Faulkner told me, my pulse quickened. This was the confession we'd sought. But it was overheard, not recorded. Ms. Faulkner had no proof besides her word. Still, it confirmed our suspicions beyond doubt. Karen had indeed dug that trench, burying the hose. She considered it some twisted demonstration about vanishing water. We debated what to do. Ms. Faulkner felt uncomfortable confronting Karen directly or publicly announcing she'd snooped on a private phone call. We decided we'd share the story with Mr. Reed, Ms. Blake, and maybe the HOA board in confidence, letting them know we had more reason to be certain of Karen's guilt. Although it wouldn't stand as legal evidence, it reinforced the moral certainty of what happened. Hearing that Karen had basically admitted it, even if privately, gave us closure. She was behind the sabotage all along. She might never face official punishment, but the incident had ironically spurred a beneficial transformation. She tried to bury a hose to prove a point, but ended up inspiring the best garden on Hillside Lane, Miss Faulkner mused. Indeed, the story felt increasingly like an odd fable, from petty sabotage to a blossoming communal success. September arrived, bringing cooler breezes and turning some trees golden. The HOA released its autumn newsletter, featuring a front-page article on smart irrigation, the drip system that inspired Hillside Lane. The piece, penned by Ms. Grant, lauded Mr. Reed's approach as both ecologically sound and visually appealing. Photos showcased bright flowers, hidden tubing, and neighbors helping each other. The article delicately referenced the prior sabotage as an unfortunate act of vandalism that spurred innovation, without naming Karen. It ended on a hopeful note. We look forward to more positive collaborations that unite beauty and conservation in our neighborhood. Karen's name never appeared, but the subtext was clear. Everyone on Hillside Lane knew who had triggered the fiasco and how it ended. In a small side column, the newsletter also outlined the official stance on water usage, that while the HOA encouraged responsible irrigation, no new restrictions were enacted. A triumph for the community's common sense. Some neighbors pinned the newsletter to their fridges, proud of being part of a successful model. Mr. Reed, flipping through the pages, felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. "I never asked for the spotlight," he said, "but it's nice to see my garden recognized as something good." By mid-autumn, Karen's once dominant presence in HOA matters seemed to fade. She still held a board position, but fewer people heeded her edicts about yard aesthetics or new paint color proposals. She lost multiple small votes on the board, as Ms. Grant and Mr. Oliver aligned with more moderate positions. Even her attempts to push pest control inspections on random properties garnered little support. It was as if the sabotage fiasco had eroded her credibility. Though never formally proven, the widely believed story was that she'd quietly orchestrated burying Mr. Reed's hose. Neighbors grew wary of her, some actively avoiding conversation. She found it harder to pass any motion that restricted personal property rights. The board's patience for her extreme views had worn thin. Occasionally, Karen tried to reignite the water usage debate, tossing around terms like future drought planning. But the presence of Mr. Reed's successful drip system served as a counterexample. showing that voluntary solutions could exist without harsh mandates. The more she complained, the more she sounded out of touch. At times, I almost felt a twinge of pity. She'd begun as a strong-willed figure in the HOA, used to pushing her agenda. Now, she was sidelined, overshadowed by the sense of camaraderie that had blossomed post-sabotage. However, her lack of remorse made it hard to sympathize too strongly. She might have forced a senior out of his hobby, if not for the neighborhood's intervention. In one final blow, Ms. Grant and Mr. Oliver announced an initiative to help more households adopt drip lines or low-flow sprinklers if desired. The HOA arranged a discount with a local hardware supplier. This effectively turned Karen's water crusade on its head. Neighbors embraced efficient watering by choice, not by her bullying. The overshadowed look on Karen's face at that meeting said it all. One crisp October morning, Mr. Reed was pruning the last of his summer blooms when Karen appeared at his fence. I happened to be walking by, so I witnessed the moment from a short distance. Karen stood quietly, clearing her throat. Mr. Reed noticed her and paused, unsure how to react. For a long beat, neither spoke. Then Karen said in a subdued voice, "Your garden's quite healthy." Mr. Reed, guarded, replied, "Yes, the new system works well." Another pause. Karen exhaled. "I might have overreacted about the watering. Maybe I was too harsh." Mr. Reed's eyebrows rose. Karen's posture stiffened. "I still believe in water conservation, but burying a hose, if that's what people believe, that was never," well, she trailed off. It wasn't a direct confession or apology, more like a halting half-admission. But it was far more contrition than any of us expected from her. Mr. Reed, gentlemanly as ever, nodded. "I appreciate the sentiment. I only do what I can to keep my flowers alive. I've always tried to be mindful of usage." Karen looked away. "I see that now." Then she mumbled something about having to go. She walked off, leaving Mr. Reed baffled. I approached, asking if he was okay. He nodded slowly. That's the closest she's come to apologizing. Not quite the words, but maybe it's all she can manage. We stood there in the golden morning light, marveling at the subtle shift. Though not a full redemption arc, it hinted Karen might finally realize she'd gone too far. Perhaps it was the slow unraveling of her influence or genuine guilt. Either way, it was a moment of uneasy peace. A week after that brief encounter, Ms. Tully revealed that Karen reached out privately, suggesting a possible compromise on future landscaping guidelines. She apparently wanted to propose a new program that encouraged drip irrigation for any who wanted to expand flower beds, merging her desire for water control with the community's love for gardens. News of this stunned me. Could Karen be shifting from sabotage to collaboration? Ms. Tully was cautiously optimistic. Karen claims she's realized forcing restrictions doesn't work. She wants to find a balance, Ms. Tully explained. We told her the board might consider it, but only if it's truly voluntary, not mandatory. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Oliver scheduled a special workshop for residents to discuss landscaping ideas, including drip systems, native plants, and mild water-saving tips. Karen asked to help organize it, focusing on responsible horticulture. She even recommended inviting a local garden center rep to speak about best practices. The reaction among neighbors was mixed. Some remained suspicious, recalling how she'd sabotaged a hose. Others welcomed the chance to channel Karen's environmental zeal in a positive, cooperative manner. Mr. Reed, hearing of the workshop, joked, "If she shares real tips instead of burying our hoses, I'll listen." Despite lingering distrust, many saw this as a sign that Karen might attempt to redeem herself. Or at least, she recognized that working with the community was more effective than clandestine sabotage. On a brisk Saturday morning, about 20 neighbors gathered outside the community center for the landscaping workshop. Ms. Tully and Mr. Oliver facilitated, introducing a representative from a local nursery who spoke about water-wise gardening. Karen arrived early, helping set up chairs. She wore a neutral expression but seemed earnest in her organizational role. The speaker demonstrated drip irrigation components, displayed a variety of drought-tolerant flowers, and explained how mulch could reduce evaporation. Attendees asked questions, shared experiences, and occasionally glanced at Karen, curious about her behavior. She listened quietly, occasionally chiming in with a thoughtful remark. At one point, Ms. Blake raised the sabotage incident indirectly, saying how adversity had led Mr. Reed to adopt drip lines. The speaker smiled, calling it a perfect example of turning conflict into a solution. Karen didn't bristle or walk away. She stayed, nodding along. Her calm acceptance of that reference surprised many. At the workshop's end, Miss Tully invited suggestions for further neighborhood improvements. Karen spoke up. We could compile a resource list for those who want to switch from overhead sprinklers to drip. Maybe a group purchase for parts. That might encourage people to do it cost-effectively. A subdued hush followed. It was constructive, rational. No mention of forced compliance. People murmured agreement. Ms. Tully accepted the idea, praising Karen's initiative. We glimpsed a faint smile on Karen's face, perhaps relief at being recognized for a positive suggestion instead of scorn. Though no one forgot the sabotage, the workshop ended on a hopeful note. If Karen genuinely funneled her energy into cooperative measures, the community might see real benefits. Mr. Reed shook Karen's hand politely, acknowledging her role in the workshop. She returned a stiff nod, perhaps symbolizing a grudging truce. Autumn deepened, painting Hillside Lane with orange and yellow leaves. Mr. Reed's garden continued to flourish, now featuring mums and asters that thrived in cooler weather. The drip system worked flawlessly. Occasionally, we'd see other neighbors adopting smaller drip setups, following Mr. Reed's example. Karen's zeal for controlling everything didn't vanish overnight, but she mostly channeled it into encouraging others to reduce water waste. She posted tips in the HOA newsletter about reusing rainwater or mulching to trap moisture. Not everyone welcomed her advice, given her history, but at least it was no longer an aggressive mandate. And crucially, no new sabotage incidents occurred. One late afternoon, I strolled by Mr. Reed's place and saw him kneeling to trim dried blossoms. He stood carefully, glancing at the hidden drip lines with a satisfied smile. Never thought I'd say this, but the sabotage led to something better, he mused. I just wish Karen hadn't done it in such a sneaky, harmful way. But we ended up more efficient. I nodded, glancing across the street where Karen's house stood. Funny how adversity can yield improvements. Mr. Reed laughed softly, a warm sound that spoke of relief. Yes, though I'd never want that experience repeated. Too stressful for my old heart. We parted, comfortable in the knowledge that Hillside Lane had weathered a storm. The story of the buried hose was fast becoming local folklore, a cautionary tale about zealotry turned destructive, then ironically spawning an even greener environment. As we approached the year's end, Hillside Lane prepared for winter. Gardens would soon rest, though some residents, inspired by Mr. Reed, added cold-hardy plants. The drip lines would remain in place, ready for next spring's bloom. The HOA board turned its attention to other matters like holiday decorations and sidewalk repairs. Karen continued on the board, though her once dominant position had receded. She seldom tried to impose sweeping changes without consensus. Occasionally, she and Mr. Reed exchanged polite greetings, never outright friendly, but no longer hostile. Ms. Blake, Miss Faulkner, and I found ourselves remarking on how the lane felt more unified after the sabotage fiasco. People had come together to defend Mr. Reed's right to garden as he pleased, forging a stronger communal bond. While no one expected Karen to transform into a laid-back neighbor, her willingness to sponsor a drip system group purchase indicated a shift. Maybe she realized bulldozing others' rights wasn't the path to a greener future. Or maybe she just recognized that resisting the entire community was futile. Either way, Hillside Lane breathed easier. One evening, Ms. Tully confided that the board would remain vigilant. We can't let another sabotage incident slip by. If Karen reverts to old habits, we'll take formal action. But for now, let's hope she's content with her new approach. That might be the best we could do, remain watchful, while hoping the fiasco's lesson stuck. Months later, the new year arrived. Hillside Lane's winter was mild, and by early spring, Mr. Reed's garden stirred with fresh shoots. The drip lines came alive once more, delivering gentle moisture beneath the soil. He planted a mix of pansies, snapdragons, and early-blooming perennials. Neighbors once again admired his handiwork. Karen, still on the HOA board, continued to promote water efficiency, but now primarily through positive methods. She circulated guides on composting and setting up rain barrels, no longer demonizing decorative flowers. Though her tone could still be sharp, the sabotage scandal taught her the community wouldn't bow to intimidation. For a contrite soul, it was subtle growth. For an unrepentant zealot, it was forced adaptation. Either way, Hillside Lane benefited from the outcome. In quiet moments, I'd recall the day we discovered Mr. Reed's hose half buried in mud, a shocking betrayal that ignited an unexpected chain of events. Thanks to neighborly solidarity, that sabotage led to a cutting-edge drip system, official HOA recognition, and a new sense of empowerment for residents. Karen's extreme act ironically birthed a more advanced, water-wise solution than the neighborhood had ever imagined. And so, life carried on. Children played on the sidewalks, seniors strolled among vibrant gardens, and the morning sun glistened on dew-kissed petals. Whenever someone new moved into the lane, they'd hear rumors of the buried hose incident, a bizarre saga that ended in triumph and unity. They'd shake their heads, amazed at how petty vendettas can yield remarkable transformations. Mr. Reed's flowers remained a testament to resilience, blooming steadfastly through each season, sustained by an unseen network of carefully laid tubes. A fitting symbol for Hillside Lane: strong roots, quiet nourishment, and a community that thrives even when challenged. Sometimes, adversity truly can sow the seeds of unexpected beauty.